Yeah, well, I think that this is a very tricky area for us, I have to say. In a performance context, things are often very fluid, changing fast. Very often, no one really has the time nor the interest to actually deal with these, shall we say, legal matters or formal matters. Which means that very often these distinctions about copyright and intellectual property and so on, they are quite undefined and fluid. I have become increasingly aware of that these may, in certain contexts, pose big problems, and so I have, through the years, tried to be more and more firm in actually stating, defining the relationship between different agents, shall we say, in a performance project. However, I must say, still though, in spite of the fact that I now usually try to make everybody sign different contracts and so on, it's actually not always possible, especially not when you have collaborations, and to define who is responsible for what, when roles really merge into each other, it is terribly complicated. As far as it is possible, I try to simplify things in these writings. Like, for instance, in this event when we went to Korea, the dancer that I brought with me here from London, a Swedish dancer in fact, she had a very, very big creative input. And I would like to say that she actually choreographed the piece. However, we wrote these contracts before we started off the creative process, and so in the contract I had defined, originally I wrote myself as the choreographer who had the entire copyright and rights to intellectual property of the piece, and I defined her as a dancer that would get certain financial compensation but could not make any claims in terms of intellectual property, and that was the agreement we signed. However, looking on the process that we then went through, I think that the contract doesn't really reflect the reality of how the work evolved and what I think fairly should have been the case. So it's a very difficult thing.
Do you revisit the contracts and then issue another one retrospectively, or do you just say, well, that's how it was? Maybe I'd have a different contractual form on another occasion, having learned from that experience?
Well, the problem is that you quite never know, at least in my practice, you don't quite know what kind of process you will go through until it actually has happened. This particular dancer is very likely we will work together again in the near future, and having the experiences I've had, we will probably formulate a different kind of contractual relationship. But because this particular project is finished, ended, we have no video from it, so there is really not much to discuss.
Did she make any additional claim, or did she say, I'm putting a hell of a lot more into this than just a dancer, or was this simply something that was implicit and this is a judgment you come to retrospectively?
Well, I think that the contract really was... I think that the role of the contract is really if you should happen to get into some problems on either legal or a personal level that you cannot resolve in a discussion person to person. I think, to me, really, that is where this whole legal framework or the contractual framework comes in. In most cases, we negotiate, we discuss, we come into a real, shall we say, practical, pragmatic solution to things. It is really if those discussions get stuck and you get into some kind of polarized positions that I think these written documents can come in and say, this is what we have actually formally agreed upon. But unless you actually come into these, shall we say, more confrontational situations, I think that these papers, to me, in a way, they are rather largely symbolic, and they don't really have that big a meaning in the process. process. When I went to Korea, I didn't even think about this, but one of the anticipated problems that my dancer foresaw was accommodation. So she specifically wanted us to put into the contract that she should have a room of her own and we will not be sharing accommodation. Of course, hearing that, of course it was absolutely obvious and quite actually, of course, I didn't think about that, but me being in that artistic process, I didn't even think of accommodation. And so she was the one that brought up that subject, which we then put into the contract. One big problem of my dance education, and I think of a lot of dance education, is that it doesn't really address these matters. I have had no module course lesson whatsoever that actually deals with legal matters in terms of writing contracts in my education. I think this is something that would be good to have a greater influence or attention to in dance education. If we compare with sports, seeing the relationship of how sports funding is getting privilege in relation to arts funding being cut, that is to me quite frustrating, in fact, and it shows to me actually what I would propose as a big cultural problem. The fact that certain activities are being hugely favored in advance of others, in terms of media attention, in terms of funding, in terms of how things are made public knowledge in a more broad, general sense. If we compare the most famous football players to the most famous dancers, what is the kind of proportions of name recognition we have going on here? I find it quite interesting to pose these questions to see that whole cultural sphere within which we operate and where we're all competing for money.